Welcome to Bible study. We're talking about the life of Elisha today and his ministry, and particularly we are looking in 2 Kings chapters 6 and 7. So if you have your Bibles handy at home, you may want to grab those and open up to that. If you've been following along with these Bible studies to this point, you know that we've been really postulating that Elisha's ministry has some key differences from that of Elijah's, and that he oftentimes works through very mundane and simple things. A handful of flour, a bit of salt in a new bowl, things like that. And oftentimes he is working inside existing structures. He doesn't upend economic or political or other kinds of institutions and structures in which he finds himself, but he operates through them and in them, oftentimes just as miraculously. But it's not this prophet standing on the outside of the structures and calling down the judgment of God upon it. It is oftentimes working through the things that are already there. The other thing we've noticed about Elisha's ministry has been that he is far more healing or restorative or really nurturing and nutritive, building up than Elijah had been. Last week we talked about, however, how the intersection of the story of Naaman and Elisha oftentimes brought a challenging witness to the people who were in exile. As a Gentile, a foreign king's general was really perceived as being far more faithful than the servant of Elisha himself. It had a strong inside-outside. We saw the same structure with the servants being the people in the know versus the people who seem to be in power. Lots of interesting themes running through the story of Naaman and Elisha. Today, we get a couple more very interesting stories that are also going to bring in some very different themes for us, that if we think about them in terms of being somebody in exile in Babylon, but also then how does that talk to us in 21st century North America? There's some really interesting things to say here. We start with a story, again, very similar, very common kind of story that we have of the Elisha cycle of stories. The prophets in chapter 6 the company of prophets are going down. They need to build a new building. They're all take an axe down to the river. They're going to cut down each of them a tree. They're going to haul it back up, and they're going to make something out of it, a log cabin of some sort. But one of the men, while he's cutting, the axe head falls off the handle and it falls into the water. This would have been a bit of a disaster because worked metal, this would have been an iron axe head, was extraordinarily valuable for them. They had not mastered this. It's not quite like today where these things are mass produced and stamped out in some factory in China and shipped over here. This would have been a handmade piece of iron which had come at extraordinary expense. And he goes, "Oh my Lord, it was borrowed. It wasn't even his." And what does Elisha do? He says, he takes a stick, he throws it into the water where the axe head fell in, and what do you know? Just as a stick floats on top of the water, now the axe head itself floats. And again, Elisha says, "You better pick that up." And we have this other miracle. Is it a life or death miracle? No. It's simply some guy lost something, and he had borrowed it, and now he can give it back. But the next miracle, the next story, is perhaps giving us an insight into how it is that Elisha can do these things. What is the world that a prophet lives in? What is it like to be a prophet? This may give us a bit of an insight that might surprise us. The king of Aram, who is also known as the king of Syria, has been waging war against Israel for years and years. This has been an ongoing conflict as these two regional minor powers compete with one another for control over these important trade routes. Elisha is functioning as the intelligence service for the king of Israel. So when the king of Aram is planning a campaign and he's got his troops over here, Elisha tells the king of Israel, oh, you want to be careful over there. That's where the king of Aram's army is. And time and again, this happens. Until finally, the king of Aram says, he doesn't understand this. He assumes he has a spy among his inner planning circle. And he finally says to them, which of you is for the king of Israel? Who is telling him these things? And again, the servants are far more aware than the master is. And they say to him, no one, my lord king, it is Elisha, the prophet in Israel, who tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. That's a rather scary thought, isn't it? The prophet knows everything that's going on. You cannot hide from him. At this point, the king does something which, if he really believes what these guys have said, is utterly inexplicable. He dispatches a force of soldiers to go surround the city where Elisha is living and effectively to arrest him. Well, if you think about it, that Elisha knows exactly what is going to happen, and he has got this sort of line into the very words of the king, he's pretty tough to surprise. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. The army comes and surrounds him at a place called Dothan, a small city in Israel. And they wake up the next morning, and the entire place is surrounded by the Syrian army. The servant of Elisha says, my master, what shall we do? And Elisha replied, well, start by not being afraid. The ones who are with us are more than the ones who are with them. And then Elisha prayed, O Lord, open his eyes so that he may see. Is this Gehazi, the servant who was given leprosy in the story before? Could well be. And his eyes are opened, and he sees that encircling the entire village of Dothan is another army. And this one is the army of the chariots of fire, the very ones who had brought Elijah up into heaven. They are all around them. And what does Elisha do? Elisha says, well, God, you've opened my servant's eyes. Please strike them blind. So he struck them with blindness, and Elisha asked, as Elisha had asked. And so Elisha walks up to them. They don't appear to be aware that they're blind, but they just can't see what is right in front of them. Elisha walks up to them and says, well, who are you looking for? And they said, well, Elisha. And they go, well, I'll bring you to the place where he is. Follow me. And so they follow him, and he leads them right into the capital city of Israel, where the very king and his army are stationed. And then Elisha says, well, let's open their eyes so they know where they are. And they open their eyes, and they see that they're inside Samaria itself. When the king of Israel saw them, he said, my father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? Elisha looks at him and goes, no. Would you kill men you had captured with a sword in battle? No. Set food and water before them, give them something to eat, and send them home. And so he prepared for them a great feast. They ate, they drank, and he sent them on their way. And they went to their master. And the Arameans, and I love the line, the Arameans didn't come anymore on raids for a while. And you can see why. It's kind of hopeless when when one old guy who all he has to do is pray to God, and you're struck blind and led into the very encampment and potentially the arrest and maybe even destruction of by your enemy. How can you fight against that? The story has a number of comedic elements. The king comes across rather funny. Elisha comes across as sort of this wise and unflappable, invincible sort of old guy who isn't going to get bothered by anything. You just can't upset him because he knows he is surrounded always by those chariots and horsemen of fire of heaven. Did Elisha see that all the time? Does that explain a little bit of how he as a prophet could be calm when everything seemed to be falling down around him? Maybe. Maybe. It certainly seems that he always trusted that was there. And does this sort of living in another world at the same time, a world that nobody else can see, empower Elisha's other deeds? Is he living in this place where he can make iron float, where he can raise dead children, where he is given to purify a well or cure or cleanse a pot of poison stew? Those kinds of strange little things that he does when he's walking in that other world, are they just as easy as you and I picking up a stick and throwing it in the water or throwing a little salt or flour? Do those things suddenly become imbued with a reality from another, plane of existence or something? I don't know. It's a very strange little insight we get into what it means to be a prophet. And what is that saying to us? Are we to live as if we also walk among those chariots and horsemen of fire? Were the children of Israel called upon to walk that way when they were in exile? If you read some of the stories that come out of it, the stories, for instance, of Daniel, the 3 men in the fiery furnace and the like, it seems to be encouraging that in the face of what looks like overwhelming enmity and force and power on the part of the Babylonians, the Daniel and his friends are not afraid. And they just continue to follow God. And they let God take care of the enemies. They just do what they are called to do. Is that something that we need to listen to? Perhaps. The next story may well be challenging the objections that we have to that. Finally, after some time, the king of Aram once more mounts an attack against Israel. He manages to defeat the armies of Israel and surrounds the capital city. He is besieging it, and things are getting very bleak, as is the case in most of the time. When you have a siege, you're really either trying to starve or dry them out, with not enough water or food. And finally, it gets desperate enough that we hear that 2 women were resorting to cannibalism, and they were eating their own children. The king tears his clothes and says, "What has happened?" And he finally says, "Where's God's help?" It feels like God is far away. In fact, he blames Elisha, because up to this point he had always trusted Elisha. Well, maybe not always, but he had many times trusted Elisha, and Elisha doesn't seem to be delivering this time. And he makes this bizarre threat. He says, "I'm going to chop Elisha's head off." Elisha, meanwhile, is sitting with the elders, and when he hears the steps of the messenger coming to take him, he says, "Why don't you go up there and hold the door shut, because that guy's coming to kill me." Elisha still knows what's going on. He still has got the intelligence, but it's not working. Or at least to the king of Israel, it doesn't feel like it's working. The king comes, and they have this confrontation. We're now at the beginning of chapter 7, if you're following along. And Elisha says to the Lord, or Elisha says to him, "Hear the word of the Lord. At this time tomorrow, food will be cheap. A measure of choice meal shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gates of Samaria." We're going to have more food than we know what to do with, and you're going to sell it for peanuts. The captain of the guard, who is with the king at this point, says to him, "How can that be?" He says, even if that army wasn't out there, food wouldn't be that cheap. And Elisha says to him, "You shall see it with your own eyes, but you won't eat of it." So now the story unfolds. And again, we have this sort of ironic, sort of upside down world picture that the Deuteronomist loves to tell us about. 4 leprous men are living in the liminal zone between the people inside the wall and the people outside the wall. They aren't allowed in the city, and they aren't really welcome in the Syrian camp either. They're beggars. But begging from starving people is a no-go proposition, and so they say, we're going to die if we stay here. Let's go out and try it with the Syrians. And so they go. To their amazement, when they get to the Syrian camp, it's empty. They get there in the middle of the night. And what had happened was that God had caused the Aramean army to believe that another army was bearing down upon them and ready to kill them. A great army. The king of Israel has hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to fight against us. And they panicked, and they fled, and they ran away, and they left everything behind. So when the lepers come into the edge of the camp, they go into a tent, and they just start eating, grabbing a bunch of stuff. They enter another tent. And then they go, there's people inside that city who don't know what happened here. And they're hungry. What we're doing is wrong. And so, let's go and tell the king's house. So they come and they stand outside the wall. It's the middle of the night, and they call to the gatekeepers. "We went to the Aramean camp, and there's no one there." The gatekeepers call to the guards go and talk to the king, to the servants, and the servants go and talk to the king. And they all go, "It's a trap." Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. How do we figure it out? They devise this plan. They follow the Aramean army. They see all the junk laying beside the road they've been throwing aside in their fear and their haste. And they come back and say, "I think it's real." They went as far as the Jordan, and the whole way was littered with garments and equipment the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. So the messengers returned, and they told the king. And then the people went out to plunder the camp of the Arameans. So a measure of choice meal was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Because one of the things the Arameans had done is bring a whole bunch of food with them, and more food than the people of Israel could eat. And so now food is cheap. Now the king had appointed the captain who had leaned on whose army he had leaned, the very guy who had questioned Elisha. He said, "You're in charge of overseeing this." And he couldn't do it, and the people trampled him at the gate. So just as Elisha had said, "You'll see it, but you won't eat of it." He died there. The man had said, "Even if the Lord were to make windows in the sky, could such a thing happen?" Can God do it? This fellow was doubting whether God could do it. The people of Israel in exile probably were wondering, can God rescue us? Is God able to? I think the Deuteronomist wants them to know, absolutely. He may do it through something just as bizarre as the sound of an invading army that isn't there. Or maybe it was an army that was there the whole time. But that just as the servant of Elisha could see it in the preceding story, maybe now this time God opened their ears and they could hear it. And maybe it was a very real army that they heard. What does this say to us as we look around and sometimes face terrible and fearsome things? I think it's calling on us once more to trust, but also to follow. Notice Elisha is in the middle of the city. He's just as hungry as everybody else is. And he too is waiting for God to do something. These sieges have been part of history for a very long time. In the late 17th century, in the 1600s, the Turkish Empire was once more resurgent, and they made an attack up the Danube River and made it all the way to the city of Vienna, where they besieged it. It looked pretty bleak. They were making progress as they were mining underneath the walls, and they were looking for weak spots in the city's defenses. Almost they were able to breach it. But suddenly then, an army unexpectedly of Poles on cavalry on horseback smashed into the outside of the Turkish army, and they all fled away. They ran, left everything behind them, including a number of large bags filled with strange dark beans. And it was the former Viennese ambassador to the Turkish court who came out and said, I want some of those. In fact, I want all of those. And nobody else knew what they were, and so they let him have them. They were coffee. And if you go to Vienna today, it is famous for its coffee houses, which were founded drinking the beans of the Turkish invaders who ran away. I hope and pray that we get a chance to talk to you about all of these things over a cup of coffee on Sunday morning or another time. God bless you. We will see you soon.